just trying to serve
Okay, so we are on lesson 6 of Bible translations, and the question that we are asking ourselves is how much interpretation should a translation do? And we realize that this is not necessarily the best question because what does it mean by more or less interpretation? And because if you say is less interpretation better, then are you saying that it's a literal translation, quote unquote literal, meaning formal, is better? Well, not necessarily. So we are looking at, okay, if when you say how much translation should a translation do, what kind of decisions are they actually making? What do you actually mean when you ask that question? And what we've learned so far is, the one answer is specificity. And we learned that formal translations tend to specify or leave the original idioms, whereas functional translations tend to specify something in the vernacular. And then we looked at confidence, that more functional translations say that we're pretty confident that this is what that means. And now for today, for the third answer to quote-unquote how much interpretation, so what they're really asking is this. It's intuition. Intuition. Each translation has to decide what their modern readers will intuitively understand. Because either a translation will assume that the readers are figuring it out for themselves. That's the formal side of things. You just specify the original idiom and you let the readers figure it out for themselves. Or they'll provide more help in understanding what the text means. And that's the more functional side of things. So basically, you've got three options when it comes to choosing figuring out whether a person reading it will intuitively understand or need some help. You'll either keep the idiom, specify the original idiom in the original language, sometimes with a footnote about what it means in the vernacular, or you modernize it and you place the idiom in the footnote, or you just modernize it and don't use any footnote. So you have basically 3 if not 4 options. So translators are having to ask themselves, to what extent is the reader not going to understand a particular translation? For instance, it's a mystery what the text means because the translators just haven't done so clearly enough. So for instance, here's one from Mark 10, 29, and 30. I came across this one recently as I was studying. So the New American Standard says this. Truly I say to you, can y'all read that? Is that big enough? Truly I say to you, no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fathers, what am I saying for the gospel's sake? But that he will receive? But that he? What does that mean? But that he? And we don't talk like that. That's a very formal or quote-unquote literal translation. But what it actually means is this. No one who has left home or brothers and so on will fail to receive 100 times as much. Do you see the difference between the formal and the functional translations there? This is a very literal, quote-unquote, formal translation, but that he will receive. But you might get confused. Well, what is but that he? I don't understand what that means. Okay? Or worse yet, you can misunderstand because it uses language that we don't tend to use. So those of you who are at Bible study on Wednesday nights, remember this one. Psalm 18:26, using the ESV. With the purified you show yourself pure, and with the crooked you make yourself seem, what's that word? What is it?
Tortuous.
Tortuous. What is that word often confused for?
Torturous.
Torturous. So there's a difference between tortuous, meaning twisted, or torturous, meaning a person likes to torture others. Here's another one. Romans 16:3. Okay. Greet Prisca and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus. Who is Prisca? Priscilla. So, Do you translate it as Prisca instead of Priscilla, even though Prisca is just a spelling variant of Priscilla, and clearly Paul has in mind Priscilla. He's not thinking of another person whose name is Prisca. It just happens to be similar to Priscilla. No, same person. So do you put one as in the text and put the other as a footnote? So notice that there is no footnote that describes what Prisca, or who Prisca refers to. The NIV, what they do is they put Priscilla in the text, and it says the Greek word is Prisca, which is a variant of Priscilla. I think the CSB, yes, it leaves Prisca, but then it says traditionally Priscilla. So those are your options there. Do you put no footnote and just assume, remember, specify the original idiom, you just assume that the readers, that intuition thing, they will just automatically understand who we're talking about here? Or do you put Priscilla in the text, like the NIV does? You specify the vernacular. You say, no, people aren't going to figure out that those are the same person unless we tell them. And so we have to put that in the text for consistency's sake. Or do you do like the CSB and you leave Prisca in the text, but then you add a footnote saying, oh, in case you're wondering who Prisca is, it's the same person as Priscilla. Are you with me? Okay. Or what about this guy Cephas? Who in the world is Cephas? Let's see here. And he would be called Cephas. So we have right there, the Gospel writer John tells us who Cephas is. But then when you get to the other uses, make it red for you. There you go. It doesn't say who Cephas is. See, look at the CSB footnotes. It doesn't say who it is. You have no idea who Cephas is unless you're a well-read person. Or the NIV does the opposite. Every time Cephas appears, it gives a little footnote, and it says, that is Peter. Every time. So that way, if you're reading the NIV, there's no doubt in your mind, Cephas equals Peter. Or I came across someone in the Old Testament recently. Here's 2 Kings 11:21. I'm going to use the ESV to compare. Wait a second. Jehoash and Joash, those are two different people, right? No, actually they're the same person. It's just a variant of spelling. So what the NIV does is it uses Joash, and it says footnote, Hebrew is Jehoash, a variant of Joash. The ESV, on the other hand, says Jehoash is an alternate spelling of Joash. So do you see how they use footnotes to help clarify? And the more formal translations will tend to leave that original word, sometimes using a footnote and sometimes not. And whereas the more functional translation, they specify it, and oftentimes they'll put in the footnotes what the original Hebrew or Greek word. The New American Standard, by the way, the 1995 edition, gives no footnote whatsoever at all. It doesn't help you at all in figuring out that Jehoash is the same person as Joash. Okay. The choices are between this. And let me use a different colored marker here. And I'm going to erase some of my wonderful drawings that I know you all have copied down perfectly in your notes. In fact, I'm just going to get rid of my cool little lines here too. Okay, so what we're going to do this time is say that it's not just about the idiom, but it's also just about the verbiage as well, just the normal language of that day. Oh, is that too light to read? No? Can you read that? Okay. So the idiom is like what was the analogy you used a couple weeks back, Allie? The cart before the horse. So that would be an idiom, okay? The verbiage is just the way that things are stated. So it's not just about the idioms, but also just about the normal way that they talked back then. So let's look at some examples. Here is Amos 4:6. Whoop. There we go. Okay, New American Standard. Who would read the NASB for us? This is that first phrase. Somebody read that?
But I gave you also cleanness of teeth in all your cities.
Okay, ignore the NIV on the right side. What does cleanness of teeth refer to? What does it mean? Good dental hygiene. Oh, yes, we all need to brush our teeth really well. No. So the NIV says, no, people aren't going to understand that idiom, that way of speaking in that day. So we're going to say, I gave you empty stomachs. So that's the NIV, which remember, it often will put it in a similar idiom in the English language. The CSB just says, I gave you absolutely nothing to eat. So it explains what it means, but it doesn't put it in an idiom like the NIV does when it says, I gave you empty stomachs. Do you see the difference there? Now let's look at another one. And I don't mean to be graphic by this one, okay? New American Standard. Someone read the NASB on the left side here.
She said to her father, let not my Lord be angry that I could not rise before you, for the manner of woman is upon me.
Okay, you stop there. Manner of women. Would you know what manner of women refers to? If you didn't have, like, the manner of women to wear makeup, I don't know, to dress up nice, to have nice hair. Well, no, the other translations, like the NIV and the CSB say, and even the ESV, say, I'm having my period. That's what that refers to. So it specifies the idiom that you might not understand if you were just reading it. Here's another one. And I think we might have already looked at this one. I can't remember. Yeah, I think we did. So the original wording is launderer. Exceeding white as no launderer on earth could whiten them. Well, the New American, the NIV says, well, he's not referring to an actual launderer. He's just referring to saying anybody could bleach them. So the NIV translates it as anyone, or no one could bleach them, whereas the NASB and the CSB say as no launderer on earth. It retains that ancient idiom. Now, when it comes to footnotes, the footnotes can be really, really helpful. The New American Standard retains more ancient idioms, but oftentimes it lacks a footnote to describe what that actually means. The CSB often uses the vernacular, and it places the original idiom in the footnotes. So let's go back to the one we just had about way of women. I'm having my period. Oh, it doesn't even say it. Let's see if there's another translation. I thought there was one translation that had a footnote that specified the original idiom. In this case, it doesn't, but oftentimes it will. The CSB uses the vernacular, and it places those ancient idioms in the footnotes, whereas the NIV uses the vernacular, and it places them in the footnotes, but it puts in the English language, it uses in the idiom itself. So remember that empty stomachs? Well, the word empty and stomachs are not there. It was cleanness of teeth. But put it in a modern day idiom. The ESV is a mixed bag. Sometimes it can't decide whether it wants to be a formal translation or a functional, and it kind of goes back and forth. No translation, to be clear, no translation keeps all the ancient idioms, because it would be literally not understandable. So the dangers of retaining an ancient idiom, meaning that you could not know what it refers to unless there's some sort of footnote or helpful guidance there to help you understand what that means. It might be confusing to readers without explaining what it meant. But on the other hand, you could miss out on some nuance that's there in the original idiom if you just put it in the vernacular. So that, like that, the one that we looked at from Mark 9:3. His garments became exceedingly white as no one on earth. Well, that's kind of cool to think of in your mind as a launderer who's sitting there bleaching his clothes or her clothes. And it adds a mental picture that you wouldn't otherwise gain if you're reading the NIV or something like that. Yeah, the next one is that, and it's very similar. So it's not just about the idiom or the verbiage, but it's about the structure as well. Structure. So do you remember how I said that the ancient Greek was all caps and no spaces and no punctuation? Do you remember how I showed you that Greek manuscript? Well, the Hebrew is very similar, except they didn't even have vowels until the Masoretes came along hundreds of years later. So we don't know exactly where the sentences began and ended and what type of grammar they were using unless you looked very, very carefully using ancient research. So for instance, here's Ephesians 1, 3-14. The New American Standard has this all in, it's all one sentence in the original Greek. But we don't tend to have sentences that are that long, that are that many words long. So should an English translation try to keep it all one sentence, or at least as lengthily as possible? Or do you break it up into several sentences? So the more formal translations try to keep structure as much as possible. So the ESV, for instance, breaks it up into 5 sentences. This whole thing right here in the ESV is 5 sentences. The CSB and the NIV, on the other hand, they have it as 8 sentences because you don't know exactly where it was broken up, and even if you think you do, that's not how we talk nowadays. Or paragraphs. When it comes to this particular section, the New American Standard uses 1 paragraph. The whole thing, 1 paragraph. The NIV and ESV, they break it up into 2 paragraphs. Whereas the CSB breaks it up into 4 paragraphs. So you can see that there. There's a break right there. There's a break right there. There's a break right there. 4 different paragraphs. So if you're asking yourself, how do I know whether the translation I'm using is one that thinks ancient grammar or structure matters more or matters less? It's actually fairly simple. If your translation that you're reading is really wordy, kind of hard to understand, it's probably a more formal translation. If it sounds more smooth, then it's probably a functional translation. If it doesn't have very many paragraphs, then it's probably a more formal translation. But if it has lots of paragraphs and like conversational changes, Jesus said this, new paragraph, John said this, you're probably using a more functional translation. Okay, last section before we get to the next one. So, when it comes to idioms, the formal translations not only specify, but they think they have meaning, that they have importance. You need to retain those, whereas the functional translations don't think that they matter as much. So the one that is often used, I think I've used it before, is that when Mary was, quote, found to be with child, or found to be pregnant, the original idiom was having in the belly, having it in the belly. Well, we don't talk like that. So no English translation keeps the idioms like that. They all say something like expecting or with child or pregnant. Okay, I'm going to skip this next section and come back to it later. And it's the Greek's use of male-oriented nouns and pronouns. This is that quote-unquote gender-neutral debate, an inclusive debate. And it's already afternoon, and there's no way that I can try to quickly do that. So we will cover that at a different time. I will say this just to kind of summarize it. No translation, to my knowledge, retains every male use in the original Greek language. So as we look at these, just remember that there are no translations that retain all the maleness that's given, because everything, not everything, a lot of things in that day had a male, either grammatical or historical use of a male, but it didn't actually mean like men or boys or males. It just meant that was the way they talked back then. Questions?
What's the version that came out, I guess many years ago now, that said they were changing they were mad because all those masculine references, and they wanted to change it to, like female or neutral or something?
Yeah, so that's the gender neutral debate, and translations of all sorts do that, and we're going to get into that later, because that is a hot topic, and it is one that you have to be informed about, otherwise you might come to a conclusion and think that they're all trying to make God she or something like that. That's not the case at all, so we'll get into that in a future. That's a great question.
I heard they're doing that in Argentina too with the language, like La Casa, or like La Casa would be La Casa. Yeah, so it's not masculine or feminine.
Yeah, we'll get into that in a future week. We don't have time to do that today. So, any other questions? All right, I'm dismissed.